Tonight's story takes us to a lonely farmhouse where memories never die and silence keeps its own secrets. The countryside looked like peace itself, rolling hills, silence so deep it felt ancient, and a house that sat like a memory in the distance. Leah and Daniel had been on the road for 5 hours before they saw it, the house they'd bought on impulse after one too many nights scrolling through listings in their cramped city apartment. It had seemed perfect, a century-old farmhouse with wide windows and an orchard out back. The real estate agent had called it a place with character. The price, suspiciously low, had been the final push. When they arrived, the late autumn light was already soft and gold, soaking the overgrown grass. Leah stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply. "You can actually hear the wind here," she said. Daniel smiled. "And not the neighbors arguing at 3 a.m. They laughed, the way couples do when they're trying to convince themselves they've made the right choice. The house watched them silently, its white paint cracked like old skin, the porch leaning just slightly forward, as if it were listening. The first night was colder than expected. They unpacked just the essentials, blankets, a kettle, 2 mugs, and camped in the living room beside the fireplace. Leah woke up sometime past midnight. Daniel was asleep beside her, his breathing steady. But from somewhere upstairs came a sound, faint, rhythmic, tap, tap, pause, tap. It wasn't the pipes. It was too deliberate. She held her breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped. She told herself it was the old house settling. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been random. It had waited for her to notice. When she finally drifted back to sleep, she dreamed of water dripping onto wood, a long, steady leak from a ceiling she couldn't see. The following morning, the sunlight felt like reassurance. Daniel busied himself fixing a loose shutter while Leah explored the house. Most of the rooms were empty, stripped of furniture except for one, a small study tucked behind the stairs. Inside was a heavy oak desk, and, oddly, a mirror hanging above it. The mirror's surface was clouded with age, but it reflected the light in a soft, silvery way. Leah reached out to wipe the dust away, and stopped. There were faint handprints on the glass, small ones, children's perhaps, but too fresh to have been there long. She called out, "Daniel, did the agent say anything about the previous owners?" "No," he shouted back. "Just that the house has been empty a while." "Why?" "Nothing," she said, though her voice faltered. That night she avoided the study altogether. Over the next few days they settled into a quiet routine. Daniel repaired floorboards and worked on the garden. Leah wrote from the kitchen table, trying to make progress on her long-abandoned novel. But small things began to shift. Objects were moved, subtly, not enough to accuse the other of it. A mug that had been in the sink would be on the counter. A chair she was sure faced the window now faced the wall. At first they joked. "Maybe we've got a helpful ghost," Daniel said, smiling. Leah smiled back, but didn't laugh. That night, as she brushed her teeth, she saw Daniel's reflection behind her in the mirror. Only he wasn't there when she turned. She froze. Her breath fogged the glass. The reflection's eyes were still there for half a heartbeat, looking right at her before the fog swallowed them. Daniel noticed the changes too, though he didn't admit it right away. The house had a way of sounding alive. Floors creaked in long, sighing rhythms. Sometimes when he walked into a room, the air would be warm, then suddenly drop cold, as if something had just left. Once, while repairing a window frame, he heard voices faintly, 2 women whispering behind the walls. He pressed his ear closer. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, anxious, almost pleading. Then, just as suddenly, silence. He didn't tell Leah. She had started sleeping poorly, waking with her hair damp with sweat. He thought it was stress, until one morning, she showed him something that made his stomach twist. "Look," she said, rolling up her sleeve. On her forearm were faint gray smudges, like fingerprints pressed into her skin. "Did you—" "Daniel," she interrupted softly. They're small, too small to be yours." That evening, Daniel searched the attic. He told himself it was for reassurance, to prove to her that the sounds were nothing. But when he pushed open the attic door, dust rolled out like smoke, and the air had that same chill, the kind that feels heavy, inhabited. The space was small, full of forgotten furniture draped in sheets. But what drew his eye were the floorboards near the far corner. A square of wood was lighter than the rest, newer, as if someone had replaced it. He pried it up. Beneath, wrapped in old cloth, were a few small objects. A porcelain doll with half its face burned black. A tarnished locket, broken open. A single shoe, a child's, no bigger than his hand, and a photograph. It showed a family standing right where the house was now. Same porch, same smile. A mother, father, and 2 children. Someone had scratched out the children's faces. He buried the box again. He didn't tell Leah about what he'd found. Not yet. But the next morning, when she went to make tea, the kettle screamed, high and shrill, like something in pain. She dropped it, scalding water splattering across the floor. As Daniel rushed in, she stood frozen, staring past him toward the staircase. A faint sound echoed from above. Tap, tap, pause, tap. She whispered, "They're playing again." Days bled together. The house grew heavier, as though every hour pulled its walls inward. Leah started hearing music, faint piano notes drifting through the rooms. Once, she followed the sound, thinking Daniel had found an old radio. It led her to the study. The desk drawer was open. Inside was a music box she'd never seen before. When she turned the key, it played the same melody she'd heard in her dreams, soft, mournful, unfinished. When the tune stopped, she heard something beneath it. A voice, breathless and close, whispering against her ear, "Finish it for us." She dropped the box. The lid snapped shut. That night, Daniel dreamed of the attic. He was standing over the open floorboard, and from inside came light, warm, golden, like sunlight under the wood. He reached for it. Tiny hands reached back. He woke, gasping, sweat cold on his skin. Beside him, Leah was already awake. She sat on the edge of the bed, whispering something under her breath. He leaned forward. "Leah?" She didn't turn. "They're just lonely," she said softly. "They don't want us to leave." The next day, Daniel drove into town. He told Leah he needed supplies, but really, he went to the records office. It took hours, but he found what he was looking for: a brittle folder labeled with their property's address. In 1954, a family had lived there. A fire had broken out one winter night. The parents escaped. The children hadn't. The mother, overcome with guilt, hanged herself in the orchard 2 weeks later. The house had stood empty since. Daniel drove home with the weight of that knowledge pressing on his chest. When he pulled up the drive, dusk was falling, and all the windows were lit. He hadn't left any lights on. Inside, the house was warm, too warm. The air felt thick, heavy with breath. He called out, "Leah?" No answer. He found her in the study, sitting at the desk. The music box was open beside her, the key turning slowly on its own. She was writing, her hand moving steadily, eyes unfocused. "Leah, what are you doing?" "They're showing me," she murmured. "The story. What really happened?" He reached for her shoulder. Her hand froze mid-word. Then she turned to him, and her eyes weren't hers anymore. They were small, childlike, full of something bottomless. "Do you remember us?" she asked, voice trembling in 2 tones at once. He grabbed her, shaking her gently, but her body was rigid, cold. "Leah, wake up!" The lights flickered. From the ceiling came that same tapping, louder now, desperate. The floorboards groaned. The mirror above the desk clouded over, and faint shapes began to form. 2 figures, blurred but moving. Children. They were watching. Then the temperature dropped like a plunge into ice. The reflection fractured, lines spreading like cracks in glass, and with a soft sigh, the lights went out. When Daniel came to, dawn was bleeding through the windows. Leah was gone. The desk was empty except for her notebook. On the open page was a single line written over and over in her handwriting. "We're still here." He searched the house, calling her name until his throat was raw. The attic, the cellar, the orchard, nothing. When the police arrived, they found him sitting on the porch steps, staring at the field. They asked questions. He barely answered. They never found Leah. 2 weeks later, Daniel returned to the house. He told himself it was to collect the rest of their things, to finally let go. But as he stepped inside, the air felt alive again, soft and humming. The study door was open. On the desk sat the music box, waiting. He turned the key. It began to play. The melody trembled, faltered, then resolved, finishing on the note Leah had never found. He smiled through tears. "You finished it," he whispered. And from behind him, Leah's voice, quiet, gentle, impossibly near, replied, "I told you, they don't want us to leave." When the real estate agent visited the next spring, the house was empty again. The garden was overgrown, the shutters hanging loose. But in the study, the mirror had been cleaned, spotless now, and if you stood in just the right light, you could see two figures reflected faintly in the glass. A man and a woman, hand in hand, smiling, listening, waiting.